In the city of Greenwood, a place with a complicated history of racial divisions, Robert Miles, a 50-year-old man with a strong build and a past full of struggles, had always known that true change would not come easily. The streets were beautiful, yet the people of this city lived under a shadow of prejudice that had seeped into every corner. The separation of races in Greenwood was like an invisible wall. The wealthy, mostly white, lived in the north where the streets were lined with homes and opportunities, while the predominantly black south, once a vibrant community, was now littered with dilapidated buildings and a lack of resources. For decades, the Greenwood Police Department had been a symbol of that divide. Black officers were few, and even fewer were given a chance at leadership. The officers of colour were treated as subordinates, their promotions few and far between, while many white officers openly disregarded the black citizens they were meant to protect. Stories of police misconduct had become the norm, and the community had lost trust in the very people who were supposed to be keeping them safe. However, Robert, who had spent 25 years in law enforcement, was different. His reputation for fighting for equality regardless of race had earned him the position of police chief in Greenwood. The mayor, hopeful for a change, made the bold decision to appoint Robert despite the controversies surrounding it. But Robert knew that even though the mayor had trusted him with this powerful role, the real battle was within the walls of the police department itself. As a black man in a predominantly white institution, Robert understood that the path to change was not going to be easy. He knew that in order to truly understand the depth of the racial tensions in his department and the city, he had to see things through a different lens. So, he did something no one would expect. Robert disguised himself as a homeless man, hiding his identity in plain sight, and wandered into the very heart of the police station. His goal was not just to see his officers in action, but to feel the harshness of their attitudes and prejudices firsthand. What he discovered shattered him. The officers whom he had once thought of as colleagues openly ridiculed and belittled people of colour. They dismissed complaints from black citizens, making cruel jokes about their supposed criminality. Robert, sitting silently in the corner, could hear the racist undertones in every conversation. The anger and hurt that had been simmering in the community for generations were now visible before his eyes. The toxic culture he had hoped to reform was deeply ingrained, but Robert was not a man who would turn away. He had seen injustice before, and he knew that in order to change a system, you had to break through its walls of complacency. With his heart heavy but resolute, he returned to his office and began crafting a strategy for reform. He would have to be patient, relentless, and above all, courageous. The question now was, could he break through the years of deeply ingrained bias and make his fellow officers see the humanity in everyone, regardless of race? Would the very people who were supposed to serve the public ever listen to him? Could he, a black man in a role where he was never meant to succeed, change the legacy of Greenwood? As Robert began his journey to confront the racism that held Greenwood captive, the streets of the city remained divided. But somewhere, in the shadows of its past, a flicker of hope burned bright. Robert knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready to fight for it. The true test lay ahead. Could Robert, with all his courage and heart, show the people of Greenwood that change was possible? And could he make the police force see past their own biases to understand the importance of justice for everyone? This was not just the story of one man's journey. It was the story of a city and the people within it, fighting for a chance to heal, to truly see one another, and to overcome the stains of history. It was about courage, justice, and the power of change. And perhaps, in the end, it would be a story about how one man, standing firm in the face of adversity, could show the world what true leadership and compassion looked like. Robert Miles had always known the importance of seeing the truth for himself, beyond the numbers and formal reports. He needed to understand the real culture of the Greenwood Police Department, the actions and attitudes that took shape when no one was watching. He had seen enough during his years of service to know that his officers might not always act with the integrity they were sworn to uphold. But now, as the new chief, he had to face the reality of the situation head-on. Late one evening in the quiet of his office, Robert devised a bold plan. He would go to the police station undercover, disguising himself as a homeless man. This would not only allow him to observe how his officers treated those on the fringes of society, but it would also test their professional ethics in real-life situations. It was a gamble, but Robert had always believed that real change could only come when people saw the truth of their actions. The next morning, he dressed carefully for the role. An old tattered coat, dirty shoes, and a woolen cap pulled low over his face. The reflection in the mirror showed him a man he barely recognized. Once a proud sheriff, now just a tired, homeless figure. But Robert didn't flinch. He knew this was what he needed to do. As he walked through the streets of Greenwood towards the police station, his heart felt heavy with the weight of the challenge ahead. The memories of his early days on the force flooded his mind, when he had been a young, eager officer, full of hope and belief in the system. Over the years, however, he had learned that not all officers upheld the values he had once believed in. He knew that the Greenwood Police Department's deep-rooted racism and toxic culture would be the toughest test of his career, but he was determined to find the heart of the problem, no matter how difficult. When Robert entered the police station, the sterile coldness of the place made him feel even more out of place. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow on the otherwise lifeless floors. A few officers were lounging in the reception area, chatting and laughing among themselves. As Robert walked toward the front desk, he kept his head low, trying not to draw attention. Peter Jenkins, a young officer in his 30s, was sitting behind the counter, his legs casually crossed and his phone in hand. His stern face softened into a brief sneer when he looked up and saw Robert approaching. "What are you doing here?" Peter asked, his voice laced with disdain. "This isn't a shelter." Robert, trying to remain composed, spoke softly. "I need help. I'm hungry and I don't know where else to go. Can you help me?" Peter didn't respond with sympathy. Instead, he laughed mockingly, stood up, and moved closer to the counter. "Help," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is a police station, not a charity. Go find a job." Robert's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "I really have nowhere else to go," he insisted. "Just need some food or directions." Peter laughed even harder, turning back to his colleagues in the corner of the room. "Listen, guys, we've got a homeless man begging for food here. Isn't this funny?" The others joined in, their laughter echoing through the room. A few even whistled, as if they were watching a comedy show. Robert glanced around the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to show even a little bit of compassion. But all he saw were mocking smiles and indifferent stares. Peter, not satisfied with merely ridiculing him, approached Robert with an air of aggression. "Listen, old man," he sneered. "You're wasting my time. You're dirtying up this station. Get out before I call some of the others to drag you out." Robert stood his ground, fighting the anger that threatened to rise within him. "I'm just asking for a little humanity," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought the police were supposed to protect the weak." But Peter's mocking laughter interrupted him before he could finish. "Humanity? You're in the wrong place for that." His words stung, but Robert refused to back down. He had seen the depths of cruelty and indifference, and he knew now more than ever that this was the culture he needed to change. As he stood there, facing the harsh reality of the situation, Robert's resolve only grew stronger. This was just the beginning. The challenge ahead of him was immense, but if he was to break the chains of racism and injustice that had a stranglehold on Greenwood, he would need to expose the rot at the core of the system. And he knew this was only the first of many steps he would have to take. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Robert was no stranger to adversity. This was his city, and he was going to fight for its future, no matter the cost. Peter's mocking words still rang in Robert's ears as he stood there, soaked in the coffee that had been poured down his chest. The laughter echoed through the sterile police station. And for a moment, Robert felt the full weight of what had just happened. The disrespect, the cruelty, and the coldness of those who were supposed to uphold the law. But as the hot liquid seeped through his tattered coat, he didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand to wipe it away. Instead, his eyes locked on Peter's, filled with a mix of sadness, disappointment, and a deep, unshakable determination. "You've demonstrated a sad point," Robert said, his voice calm, but heavy with the burden of generations of injustice. "People like me, the weak and vulnerable, should be your protection. Instead, you ridicule and humiliate us. You have not only hurt me, you have dishonored the very honor of this profession." Peter seemed momentarily taken aback by Robert's calm response, but his arrogance quickly returned. "Are you giving me a moral lecture?" he sneered, his voice dripping with defiance. "Get out of here before I throw you out myself." Robert said nothing more. He turned and walked slowly out of the station, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of the mockery, the broken trust, and the racism that had been allowed to fester in the very institution he now led pressed down on him like a lead weight. As he walked toward the door, no one stopped him. No one intervened. The laughter continued, and Peter's mocking voice echoed behind him. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter in his life. Outside, the cold air hit Robert's face, but it did little to numb the sting of what had just happened. The humiliation was not just in the physical pain of the coffee. It was in the cruel reminder of how deeply embedded racism and ignorance were in the force. His colleagues, the people he was supposed to work with, had shown him exactly how they viewed him. Not as the police chief, but as a target for their ridicule. But Robert refused to let those feelings take control. He knew that responding with anger or aggression would only feed into the toxic culture he was trying to change. Instead, he focused on what needed to be done next. He couldn't allow this moment to derail him. The first step, he decided, was to avoid a hasty reaction. Confronting Peter or any of the officers immediately would not only be futile, but would also make things worse. He had a bigger plan in mind, one that required the support of the community and the city's leadership. He needed to go to the mayor. As Robert drove to the mayor's office, the weight of the morning's events weighed heavily on him. He could still feel the humiliation, the sting of being rejected and belittled in the very place that was supposed to uphold justice. But despite the pain, he knew one thing. He couldn't let the system that had bred such hatred and disrespect continue to thrive. It was his calling to change it, to bring true justice to Greenwood. Arriving at the mayor's office, Robert paused for a moment before knocking on the door. He placed his hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and tried to steady his nerves. He knew that what he was about to ask for would have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire city. But he also knew it was the only way forward. When the mayor, Gerald Collins, looked up from his desk, Robert didn't immediately speak. He stood for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The mayor had always been supportive of his appointment, but now Robert needed more than just words of encouragement. He needed action. Finally, he spoke. "Mayor Collins, I've seen the truth. I've seen how the police department operates, and I've seen how deeply embedded racism and prejudice are. This culture has been allowed to fester for far too long. I can't change this alone. I need your support, your commitment to real reform. Together, we can fix this, but it's going to take more than just a change of leadership. It's going to take a complete overhaul of the way things have been done here." The mayor looked at him with a mixture of concern and respect. He had always admired Robert's dedication, but now it was clear that this battle was not going to be easy. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I know this is going to be difficult, Robert," Mayor Collins said. "But if you believe in this cause, if you truly think we can make a change, I'm willing to stand by you. But we need to act quickly. There are forces within the department that will resist, and we need to be prepared for that." Robert nodded. He knew the road ahead would be hard, but with the mayor's support, he believed change was possible. Together, they would take the first steps toward dismantling the toxic culture within the police force and creating a new path forward for Greenwood. But the real test was still ahead, getting his officers to understand that the change wasn't just about a new leader. It was about a new way of thinking, a new way of policing, and that, Robert knew, would be the hardest battle of all. The tension in the air was palpable as Robert walked into the police station the next morning, his steps echoing through the corridors like the reverberations of a distant storm. The usual hum of idle chatter and light-hearted gossip came to a sudden halt as the doors swung open. Robert's silhouette, clad in the sheriff's uniform that symbolized both authority and responsibility, cut a stark contrast to the group of officers gathered inside. Standing tall and proud beside him was Mayor Gerald Collins, a respected figure in the city, who now stood as a symbol of support for the change Robert was determined to bring. The officers, once brimming with jokes and mockery, now stood in stunned silence. They were no longer laughing. Their eyes followed Robert as he walked through the room, and for the first time, they saw him not as a figure of ridicule, but as the man who would lead them into the future. The sound of his footsteps seemed to carry a message, a warning. This was not a man to be underestimated. The mayor's voice broke the silence. Today, I am honored to introduce to you our new police chief, Robert Miles. Mayor Collins gestured toward Robert, and the weight of his words settled into the room. Robert Miles, our newly appointed chief of police, will lead this department for many years to come. The words hung in the air, thick with disbelief. From the seasoned veterans to the young recruits, no one could believe their ears. Yesterday, they had ridiculed this very man. They had laughed at his worn, tattered appearance, had mocked him without a second thought. Now, the very person they had insulted was standing before them, not as a victim, but as their new chief, someone who held the power to shape their future. A heavy silence followed, and in the midst of it, all eyes turned to Robert. The reality of the situation began to sink in. The jokes, the taunts, and the mockery from the day before now seemed foolish, childish. The officer who had spilled coffee on Robert, Peter Jenkins, stood frozen in place, his face pale and devoid of expression. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the words to explain himself, but none came. The laughter he had shared with his colleagues just yesterday felt like a betrayal now, a painful reminder of his own ignorance and disrespect. Peter's eyes met Robert's, and for the first time he felt the weight of his actions. The man he had ridiculed was not the weak, helpless figure he had assumed him to be. Robert was strong, resolute, and now he was their leader. The shame that Peter felt in that moment was almost suffocating. He couldn't bring himself to meet Robert's gaze again. The shift in power was complete, and the room was charged with the electricity of this realization. Chief Robert Miles stood tall, his gaze steady, but deep within, he understood the complexity of the situation. He had made the choice not to react in anger the day before, but now, in front of his new team, he knew that this was the moment where real change would begin. He had to face these officers, many of whom had treated him with disdain, but he couldn't let bitterness cloud his judgment. They had no idea how much they had underestimated him, nor could they yet understand the depth of the transformation he was about to lead. The silence in the room was thick with tension as Robert stepped forward, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of authority. "I know many of you may not understand this decision," he began, his tone unwavering. "I know that some of you may have doubts about my leadership, about my ability to change this department. But I'm here to tell you this: I am not here to play games. I am here to bring justice, real justice. And if that means confronting uncomfortable truths, then so be it. This department will no longer be a place where racism, ignorance, and disrespect are tolerated. We will work together, or we will not work at all." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado fading as Robert's words sank in. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had once felt like a moment of ridicule for Robert now seemed like the beginning of something much larger, something that could not be undone. Peter, still frozen in place, found himself drowning in guilt. His earlier actions felt like a personal betrayal, not just of Robert, but of everything he had once believed about justice and respect. This was no longer about being a tough cop or getting away with things for the sake of tradition. The new sheriff was not just a black man. He was a man of integrity, a man who had proven that true strength came from compassion and courage. Chief Robert Miles stood before his team, unwavering as they processed the magnitude of what had just happened. Some of them, the older officers who had been in the force long enough to see things through a cynical lens, might have felt the familiar urge to resist, but for the first time in a long time, Robert felt that the tide had begun to turn. He was not naive. He knew that change would not come overnight, but he also knew that every revolution, no matter how big or small, began with a single spark. Today, in the Greenwood Police Department, that spark had been ignited. Robert would lead them through the tough work ahead, and he would make them realize that change, no matter how difficult, was the only path forward. As the room fell into a tense quiet, Robert locked eyes with Peter one last time. It was a look of understanding, a look that communicated both the pain of yesterday and the hope for tomorrow. Robert didn't need to say anything more. His leadership had already spoken volumes. The room remained eerily quiet, the weight of Robert's words sinking in with every passing second. As he stood at the front, his posture firm and his gaze unwavering, it was clear to every officer in the room that this moment marked a new beginning, a shift in the very core of their police department. They had been caught in the comfort of old habits, where ridicule and prejudice had gone unchecked. But Robert Miles, their new chief, had just shattered that false sense of security with the sharpness of his resolve. Peter Jenkins stood frozen, in place, his face ashen, his mind scrambling for an explanation. But the words simply wouldn't come. Yesterday, he had been a man of mockery and arrogance, surrounded by his peers, laughing at Robert's expense. Today, he found himself a pariah, his career and dignity crumbling before him. Robert's words hung in the air like a weight that he could no longer escape. "You are hereby terminated," Robert's voice cut through the silence, each syllable heavy with the finality of the decision. "Peter Jenkins, you have failed to demonstrate the basic qualities of a police officer. You have shown a lack of respect for your colleagues and the citizens we are sworn to protect. Your conduct is unacceptable in a police force." Peter stood, still, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the floor, unable to grasp the gravity of what was happening. He had never considered the consequences of his actions. He had assumed his behavior would go unchallenged, just as it had many times before. But now, faced with the undeniable reality, he felt small, insignificant, and utterly exposed. His heart raced, his mind unable to process the swift and irreversible turn his life had just taken. Around him, the room was filled with the unspoken tension of regret. Several officers glanced at each other, the unease in their eyes betraying the dawning realization that Robert's decision wasn't just about one man's failure. It was about a deep, systemic problem that had gone unchecked for far too long. The taunts, the mockery, the racism, these were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a culture that had allowed them to fester. "Not only did you insult me, Peter," Robert continued, his voice steady and clear, "you insulted the dignity of a human being. You mocked someone without knowing who they were. And what's even worse, none of you stood up to stop it. None of you intervened. None of you defended what is right. This is not just about one man. This is about the very fabric of this department and what we are willing to tolerate." A collective sigh rose from the group of officers. The weight of Robert's words seemed to hang over them like a cloud, each officer grappling with their own sense of shame. Yesterday, they had been part of the laughter. Today, they were part of the problem. And they knew that things were about to change for good. "This is the kind of behavior I will not tolerate," Robert said, his voice growing even more resolute. "This department is built on a foundation of respect, ethics, and justice. If any of you cannot stand up for each other, if any of you cannot demonstrate the basic values of this profession, then we cannot be a team. We cannot serve the public, and we cannot fulfill our duty as law enforcement officers." As Robert's gaze swept over the room, his eyes locked onto each officer, reading the confusion, the shame, and the deep realization in their faces. This was the moment where they had to decide whether they would stand by and let the toxic culture continue, or whether they would rise to the challenge and change. "You all have a responsibility," Robert continued, his tone unwavering, "not only to uphold the law, but to protect the dignity of every individual we encounter. This is a call to action, to each and every one of you. The time for tolerance of ignorance, racism, and disrespect is over. From now on, we are a team bound by respect, fairness, and justice. I will not let this department tarnish the very ideals we are sworn to protect." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence once again, but this time, it was different. The officers, once resistant to change, now understood that they had been part of something that needed to end. They had been complicit in a culture of disrespect, and now they were faced with the consequences of their inaction. They had two choices: evolve and rise to the occasion, or remain stuck in the past and face the consequences. Robert's decision to fire Peter Jenkins was not just about one individual, it was a statement. It was a message to every officer in that room that no behavior, no matter how ingrained it was, would go unchecked. He was setting a new standard for what it meant to serve and protect. And for the first time, the officers in that room understood that the real work was only just beginning. "Tomorrow we start fresh," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of the future. "There will be no room for discrimination, no room for ridicule, and no room for disrespect. We are here to serve the people, not tear them down, and anyone who cannot embrace that will have no place here." With that, Robert turned and left the room, the power of his words still resonating in the silence he left behind. The officers who had once been part of a culture of mockery and contempt were now confronted with a choice: to step up and meet the high standard of integrity and respect that Robert had set, or to face the consequences of remaining in a toxic environment that had no place in the future of law enforcement. As the door closed behind him, the officers sat in stunned silence, the weight of the shift in leadership settling over them. The change had begun, and whether they were ready or not, it was coming for them. The police department, but also in the neighborhoods they served, Robert's leadership was making a tangible difference. The once tense and divisive atmosphere within, the department had begun to transform into a place where officers were more attuned to the realities of the communities they protected. Through education and open dialogue, Robert was slowly bridging the gap between law enforcement and the people they swore to protect. The changes were not just about policy or ethics, they were about fostering a culture of accountability, transparency, and mutual respect. Officers who had previously felt disconnected from the people they served now saw their role in a new light. They understood that their duty extended beyond enforcing the law. It was about being pillars of integrity within the community. Mark's transformation was one of the most noticeable. Once indifferent to issues of racism, he now took proactive steps to make amends for his past behavior. By actively participating in community outreach programs, Mark not only demonstrated the power of change, but also set an example for his colleagues. His blog posts, sharing his personal journey of growth and the positive impact Robert had on his outlook, became a beacon of hope for others. He wrote about how embracing respect for all people, regardless of background, made his work more fulfilling and honorable. Mark's newfound commitment to fairness helped others in the department realize that this wasn't just about changing their actions, it was about changing their hearts and minds. Julia, too, underwent a significant shift in perspective. No longer silent when witnessing discriminatory behavior, she now became a vocal advocate for ethics in the department. Her active participation in discussions about workplace behavior helped reshape the department's culture. She worked tirelessly to ensure new recruits understood the core values that Robert was instilling in the force, and she made it a point to confront inappropriate behavior whenever she saw it. At community meetings, Robert's decision to create open spaces for dialogue between officers and citizens led to meaningful conversations. Before these meetings, there had been a deep divide between law enforcement and the people they served. Fear, mistrust, and misunderstanding clouded every interaction. But with Robert's leadership, those barriers started to crumble. The people who once felt that police were distant figures of authority now saw them as accessible, approachable allies. Neighborhoods that had once been wary of the police now began to feel the weight of positive change. Robert's efforts created a shift in the community's perception of law enforcement, a shift that was long overdue. And in return, the police force gained more trust, not only from the citizens, but also from within its own ranks. The ripple effect of these changes reached far beyond the department. Families began to feel safer in their own neighborhoods. Children looked at police officers with a new sense of respect, not fear. People felt that they could now express their concerns without the fear of being dismissed or mistreated. Robert's leadership had ignited a fire of hope in a place that had long been shrouded in doubt. Even the media, once skeptical of Robert's appointment, began to change their tone. Articles started to highlight the positive transformation happening within the department, focusing on the real impact Robert was having on both his officers and the citizens they served. He had become a symbol of what was possible when real change was pursued with determination and conviction. But Robert knew that the work was far from over. There was still resistance, still pockets of resentment and deep-seated prejudice that would not disappear overnight. He had made a start, but real, lasting change required more than a few speeches and training courses. It required sustained effort, relentless commitment, and a willingness to hold people accountable, even when it was uncomfortable. As Robert looked out over his department, he saw the beginnings of the transformation he had envisioned. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be for some time. But for the first time in a long while, he saw officers beginning to take pride in the values they were sworn to uphold. They were no longer simply enforcing laws, they were living them. And as for the community, Robert's impact was already being felt. People were beginning to trust the police again, not because of their uniforms or badges, but because they saw the men and women in those uniforms as agents of positive change. It was a long road ahead, but Robert Miles was leading the way, and he would not stop until he had transformed not only the police department, but the entire city. Chapter in this journey of transformation. Robert's leadership wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about setting a new standard, one rooted in dignity, respect, and equality. His commitment to fairness and to uplifting both his officers and the community had already started to heal deep-seated wounds that had festered for years. The symbolism of his rise to leadership was not lost on anyone. For the Black community, Robert was more than just the new chief. He was a beacon of hope, proving that change was not only possible but also happening in real time. He became a figure of pride, a man who understood their struggles and was committed to protecting their rights. In many ways, Robert was showing them that they no longer had to fear the institution that was supposed to protect them. He was, after all, one of their own, leading with heart and wisdom. Civil rights organizations and advocacy groups, which had often criticized law enforcement for its racial biases, now saw Robert as a living example of the change they had long fought for. His decision to prioritize ethics, fairness, and inclusivity within the department sent a powerful message that even in the face of resistance, transformative leadership was possible. At every civil rights conference he attended, Robert's speeches became a rallying cry for others striving for justice. His words resonated deeply, not just with the people of his community, but with anyone who had ever felt disenfranchised or marginalized. His message was clear. True justice meant equal protection for all, regardless of race, class, or background. Each time Robert spoke, he was met with enthusiastic applause, and it was no wonder that his message began to spread like wildfire. The transformation wasn't just limited to the department. It had ripple effects that reached deep into the community. Neighborhoods that once saw the police as an intimidating, distant force began to look at them differently. Now, under Robert's leadership, they saw the police as part of their community, individuals they could trust and depend on for fairness and protection. This was not a quick shift, but it was happening. Robert's actions, grounded in respect for every citizen, were slowly rebuilding bridges that had been broken for far too long. As the final ethics training course came to an end, Robert stood before his officers with that same unwavering conviction. "We are police officers, and our job is to protect and serve all people without distinction," he said. It wasn't just a statement, it was a vow to lead the department in a way that would make the community proud. He understood the weight of his words and the responsibility that came with his role. For him, it wasn't about power or title. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, could trust the police to be guardians of justice. In the end, Robert didn't just transform the police department, he became a role model for his community. His leadership went beyond policy changes. It became a movement to prove that fairness, justice, and respect could define law enforcement, and that through action, people could rise above prejudice and create real change. The legacy he was creating would be felt for years to come, and as Robert's work continued to inspire both his officers and the community, the message was clear: this was only the beginning. The journey toward a more just and fair society was long, but with leaders like Robert Miles, it was clear that the path forward would be one filled with hope, dignity, and unwavering commitment to the values that bound everyone together.